The Horse and His Boy, Book 3 of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 6, Shasta Among the Tombs. Shasta ran lightly along the roof on tiptoes. It felt hot to his bare feet. He was only a few seconds scrambling up the wall at the far end. When he got to the corner, he found himself looking down into a narrow, smelly street, and there was a rubbish heap out against the outside of the wall, just as Corin had told him. Before jumping down, he took a rapid glance around him to get his bearings. Apparently, he had now come over the crown of the island hill on which Tashbaan was built. Everything sloped away before him, flat roofs below flat roofs, down to the towers and battlements of the city's northern wall. Beyond that was the river, and beyond the river a short slope covered with gardens. But beyond that again there was something he had never seen the like of. A great yellowish-gray thing, flat as a calm sea, and stretching for miles. On the far side of it were huge blue things, lumpy but with jagged edges, and some of them with white tops. The desert, the mountains, thought Shasta. He jumped down into the rubbish and began trotting along downhill as fast as he could, in the narrow lane, which soon brought him into a wider street where there were more people. No one bothered to look at a little ragged boy running along in bare feet. Still, he was anxious and uneasy until he turned a corner, and there he saw the city gate in front of him. Here he was pressed and jostled a bit, for a good many other people were also going out. And on the bridge beyond the gate, the crowd became quite a slow procession, more like a queue than a crowd. Out there, with clear running water on each side, it was deliciously fresh after the smell and heat and noise of Tashbaan. When once Shasta had reached the far end of the bridge, he found the crowd melting away. Everyone seemed to be going either to the left or right along the river bank. He went straight ahead up a road that did not appear to be much used, between the gardens. In a few paces he was alone, and a few more brought him to the top of the slope. There he stood and stared. It was like coming to the end of the world, for all the grass stopped quite suddenly a few feet before him, and the sand began. Endless level sand like on a seashore, but a bit rougher because it was never wet. The mountains, which now looked further off than before, loomed ahead. Greatly to his relief, he saw, about 5 minutes' walks away, on his left, what must certainly be the tombs, just as Bree had described them. Great masses of moldering stone shaped like gigantic beehives, but a little narrower. They looked very black and grim, for the sun was now setting right behind them. He turned his face west and trotted towards the tombs. He could not help looking out very hard for any sign of his friends, though the setting sun shone in his face so that he could see hardly anything. And anyway, he thought, of course they'll be round on the far side of the forest tomb, not this side where anyone might see them from the city. There were about 12 tombs, each with a low arched doorway that opened into absolute blackness. They were dotted about in no kind of order, so that it took a long time going around this one and going around that one before you could be sure you had looked round every side of every tomb. That was what Shasta had to do. There was nobody there. It was quiet here on the edge of the desert, and now the sun had really set. Suddenly, from somewhere behind him, there came a terrible sound. Shasta's heart gave a great jump, and he had to bite his tongue to keep himself from screaming. Next moment he realized what it was. The horns of Tashbaan blowing for the closing of the gates. "Don't be a silly little coward," said Shasta to himself. "Why, it's only the same noise you heard this morning. But there is a great difference between a noise hearing, letting you in with your friends in the morning, and a noise heard alone at nightfall, shutting you out." And now that the gates were shut, he knew there was no chance of the others joining him that evening. Either they're shut up in Tashbaan for the night, thought Shasta, or else they've gone on without me. It is just the sort of thing that Erebus would do, but Bree wouldn't. Oh, he wouldn't now, would he? In this idea about Erebus, Shasta was once more quite wrong. She was proud and could be hard enough, but she was true as steel and would never have deserted a companion, whether she liked him or not. Now that Shasta knew he would have to spend the night alone, it was getting darker every minute. He began to like the look of the place less and less. There was something very uncomfortable about those great silent shapes of stone. He had been trying his hardest for a long time not to think of ghouls, but he couldn't keep it up any longer. "Ow! Ow! Help!" he shouted suddenly, for at that very moment he felt something touch his leg. I don't think anyone can be blamed for shouting if something comes up from behind and touches him, not in such a place and at such a time, when he is frightened already. Shasta, at any rate, was too frightened to run. Anything would be better than being chased around and around the burial place of ancient kings with something he dared not look at behind him. Instead, he did what was really the most sensible thing he could do. He looked round, and his heart almost burst with relief. What had touched him was only a cat. The light was too bad now for Shasta to see much of the cat, except it was big and very solemn. It looked as if it might have lived for a long, long years among the tombs alone. Its eyes made you think it knew secrets it would not tell. "Puss, puss," said Shasta. "I suppose you're not a talking cat." The cat stared at him harder than ever. Then it started to walk away, and of course Shasta followed it. It led him right through the tombs and right out on the desert side of them. There it sat down bolt upright with its tail curled around its feet and its face set towards the desert and toward Narnia in the north. As still as if it were watching for some enemy, Shasta lay down beside it with his back against the cat and his face towards the tombs, because if one is nervous there's nothing like having your face towards the danger and having something warm and solid at your back. The sand wouldn't have seemed very comfortable to you, but Shasta had been sleeping on the ground for weeks and hardly noticed it. Soon he fell asleep, and even in his dreams he went on wondering what had happened to Bree and Erebus and Hwin. He was wakened suddenly by a noise he had never heard before. Perhaps it was only a nightmare, said Shasta to himself. At that same moment he noticed that the cat had gone from his back, and he wished it hadn't. But he lay quite still without even opening his eyes, because he felt sure he would be more frightened if he sat up and looked round at the tombs and the lonesomeness, just as you or I might lie still in bed, clothes over our head. But then the noise came again, a harsh, piercing cry from behind him, out of the desert. Then, of course, he had to open his eyes and sit up. The moon was shining brightly. The tombs, far bigger and nearer than he thought they would be, looked gray in the moonlight. In fact, they looked horribly like huge people draped in gray robes that covered their heads and faces. They were not at all nice things to have near you when spending the night alone in a strange place. But the noise had come from the opposite side, from the desert. Shasta had to turn his back on the tombs, he didn't like that much, and stare across the level sand. A wild cry rang out again. I hope it's not more lions, thought Shasta. It was in fact not very like the lions' roars he had heard on the night before when they met Hwin and Erebus, and really the cry of a jackal. But of course Shasta didn't know this. Even if he had known, he would not have wanted very much to meet a jackal. The cries rang out again and again. There's more than one of them, whatever they are, thought Shasta, and they're coming nearer. I suppose that if he had been an entirely sensible boy, he would have gone back through the tombs nearer the river, where there were less houses and wild beasts would less likely to be there to come. But then there were, or he thought there were, the ghouls. To go back through the tombs would mean going past those dark openings in the tombs, and what might come out of them? It may have been silly, but Shasta felt he had rather risked the wild beasts. Then as the cries came nearer and nearer, he began to change his mind. He was just going to run for it when suddenly between him and the desert a huge animal bounded into view. As the moon was behind it, it looked quite black, and Shasta did not know what it was, except that it had a very big, shaggy head and went on 4 legs. It did not seem to have noticed Shasta, for it suddenly stopped and turned its head towards the desert, and let out a roar which re-echoed through the tombs and seemed to shake the sand under Shasta's feet. The cries of the other creatures suddenly stopped, and he thought he could hear feet scampering away. Then the great beast turned to examine Shasta. "It's a lion. I know it's a lion," thought Shasta. "I'm done. I wonder, will it hurt much? I wish it was over. I wonder, does anything happen to people after they're dead? Oh, here it comes," and he shut his eyes and teeth tight. But instead of teeth and claws, he only felt something warm lying down at his feet, and when he opened his eyes, he said, "Why, it's not nearly as big as I thought. It's only half the size. No, it isn't even a quarter the size. I do declare it's only the cat. I must have dreamed all that about it being as big as a horse." And whether he really had been dreaming or not, what was now lying at his feet and staring him out of countenance with its big green unwinking eyes was the cat, though certainly one of the largest cats he had ever seen. "Oh, Puss," gasped Shasta, "I am so glad to see you again. I've been having such horrible dreams." And he at once lay down again, back to back with the cat as they had been at the beginning of the night. The warmth from it spread all over him. "I'll never do anything nasty to a cat again as long as I live," said Shasta, half to the cat and half to himself. "I did once, you know. I threw stones at a half-starved, mangy old stray. Hey, stop that!" For the cat had turned round and given him a scratch. "None of that," said Shasta. "It isn't as if you could understand what I'm saying." Then he dozed off. Next morning when he woke, the cat was gone. The sun was already up and the sand hot. Shasta, very thirsty, sat up and rubbed his eyes. The desert was blindingly white, and though there was a murmur of noises from the city behind him, where he sat everything was perfectly still. When he looked a little left and west, so that the sun was not in his eyes, he could see the mountains on the far side of the desert, so sharp and clear that they looked only a stone's throw away. He particularly noticed that one blue height that divided two peaks at the top, and decided that must be Mount Pier. "That's our direction, judging by what the raven said," he thought, "so I'm sure must make of it, so as not to waste any time when the others show up." So he made a good, deep, straight furrow with his foot pointing exactly to Mount Pier. The next job, clearly, was to get something to eat and drink. Shasta trotted back through the tombs. They looked quite ordinary now, and he wondered how he could ever have been afraid of them, and down into the cultivated land by the river's side. There were a few people about, but not very many, for the city's gates had been open several hours, and the early morning crowds had already gone in. So he had no difficulty in doing a little raiding, as Bree called it. It involved a climb over a garden wall, and the results were 3 oranges, a melon, a fig or 2, and a pomegranate. After that he went down to the river bank, but not too near the bridge, and had a drink. The water was so nice that he took off his hot, dirty clothes and had a dip, for of course Shasta, having lived in the shore all his life, had learned to swim almost as soon as he had learned to walk. When he came out, he lay on the grass looking across the water at Tashbaan. All the splendor and strength and glory of it, but that made him remember the dangers of it too. He suddenly realized that the others might have reached the tombs while he was bathing, and gone on without me as likely as not. So he dressed in a fright and tore back at such a speed that he was all hot and thirsty when he arrived, and so the good of his bath was gone. Like most days when you're alone and waiting on something, this day seemed to be about 100 hours long. He had plenty to think of course, but sitting alone, just thinking, is pretty slow. He thought a good deal about the Narnians, and especially about Corin. He wondered what happened when they discovered the boy who had been lying on the sofa, and hearing all their secret plans wasn't Corin at all. It was very unpleasant to think of all those nice people imagining him a traitor. But as the sun slowly climbed up to the top of the sky, and then slowly began going downward to the west, and no one came and nothing at all happened, he began to get more and more anxious. And of course he now realized that when they arranged to wait for one another at the tombs, no one had said anything about how long. He couldn't wait here for the rest of his life, and soon it would be dark again, and he would have another night just like last night. A dozen different plans went through his head, all wretched ones, and at last he fixed on the worst plan of all. He decided to wait till it was dark and then go back to the river and steal as many melons as he could carry and set out for Mount Pier alone, trusting for his direction to line he had drawn that morning in the sand. It was a crazy idea, and if he had read as many books as you have about journeys over deserts, he would never have dreamed it. But Shasta had read no books at all. Before the sun set, something did happen. Shasta was sitting in the shadow of one of the tombs when he looked up and saw two horses coming towards him. Then his heart gave a great leap, for he recognized them as Bree and Hwin. But the next moment his heart went down into his toes again. There was no sign of Erebus. The horses were being led by a strange man, an armed man, pretty handsomely dressed like an upper slave in a great family. Bree and Hwin were no longer got up like pack horses, but saddled and bridled. And what could that all mean? It's a trap, thought Shasta. Somebody has caught Erebus, and perhaps they've tortured her, and she's given the whole thing away. They want me to jump out and run up and speak to Bree, and then I'll be caught too. And yet if I don't, I may be losing my only chance to meet the others. Oh, I do wish I knew what happened. And he sulked behind the tomb, looking out every few minutes, wondering which was the least dangerous thing to do. Chapter 7. Erebus in Tashbaan. What had really happened was this. When Erebus saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians and found herself alone with two horses, who, very wisely, wouldn't say a word, she never lost her head for even a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both the horses, as though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer. She did nothing to show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again, but before she could take a step, another crier, bother all these people, thought Erebus, was heard shouting out, "Way, way, way, way for the Tarquinia Larisaline." And immediately following the crier came 4 armed slaves, and then 4 bearers carrying a litter which was all aflutter with silken curtains, and all a jingle with silver bells, and which scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. After the little female slaves in beautiful clothes, and then a few grooms, runners, and pages, and the like. And now Erebus made her first mistake. She knew Larisaline very well, almost as if they had been at school together, because they had often stayed in the same house and been to the same parties. And Erebus couldn't help looking up to see what Larisaline looked like now that she was married, and a very good person indeed. It was fatal. The eyes of the two girls met, and immediately Larisaline sat up in the litter and burst out at the top of her voice, "Erebus, what on earth are you doing here? Your father—" There was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Erebus let go of the horses, caught the edge of the litter, and swung herself up beside Larisaline, and whispered furiously in her ear, "Shut up, do you hear? Shut up. You must hide me. Tell your people." "But, darling," began Larisaline in the same loud voice. She didn't in the least mind making people stare. In fact, she rather liked it. "Do what I tell you, or I'll never speak to you again," hissed Erebus. "Please, please, be quick, lass. It's frighteningly important. Tell your people to bring those 2 horses along. Pull all the curtains of the litter and get away somewhere where I can't be found. And do hurry." "All right, darling," said Larisaline in her lazy voice. "Here, 2 of you take the Tarquinia's horses." This was to the slaves. "And now home, I say. Darling, do you think we really want the curtains drawn on a day like this? I mean to say." But Erebus had already drawn the curtains, enclosing Larisaline and herself in a rich and scented but rather stuffy kind of tent. "I mustn't be seen," she said. "My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away." "My dear, how perfectly thrilling," said Larisaline. "I'm dying to hear all about it, darling. You're sitting on my dress. Do you mind?" That's better. It's a new one. Do you like it? I got it at... Oh, lass, do be serious, said Aravis. Where is my father? Didn't you know? Said Louise Celine. He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday and is asking about you everywhere. And to think of you and me being here together, and his not knowing anything about it. It's the funniest thing I've ever heard. And she went off into giggles. She always had been a terrible giggler, as Aravis now remembered. It isn't funny at all, she said. It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me? No difficulty at all, my dear, said Louise Celine. I'll take you home. My husband's away and no one will see you. Phew, it's not much fun with the curtains drawn. I want to see people. There's no point in having a new dress on if no one's going to be shut up like this. I hope no one heard but you when you shouted out to me like that, said Aravis. No, no, of course, darling, said Louise Celine absent-mindedly. But you haven't even told me yet. What do you think of the dress? Another thing, said Aravis, you must tell your people to treat those two horses very respectfully. They're part of the secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia. Fancy, said Louise Celine. How exciting. And oh, darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashbaan at present. They say Prince Rabadash is madly in love with her. They have been the most wonderful parties and hunts and things all this last fortnight. I can't see she's so pretty myself, but some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken out on a river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my... How shall we prevent your people telling everyone that you've got a visitor dressed like a beggar's brat in your house? It might so easily get round to my father. Now don't keep fussing. There's a dear, said Louise Celine. We'll get you some proper clothes in a moment. And here we are. The bearers had stopped, and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains had been drawn, Aravis found that she was in a courtyard garden, very like the one that Shasta had been taken into a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. Louise Celine would have gone indoors at once, but Aravis reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head, said Louise Celine. Here, all of you, and you, doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of the house today, and anyone I catch talking about this young lady will be first beaten to death and then burned alive, and then after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. There. Although Louise Celine had said she was dying to hear Aravis's story, she showed no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. She was, in fact, much better at talking than at listening. She insisted on Aravis having a long and luxurious bath. Curomine baths are famous. And then dressing her up in the finest clothes before she would let her explain anything. The fuss she made about choosing the dresses nearly drove Aravis mad. She remembered now that Louise Celine had always been like that, interested in clothes and parties and gossip. Aravis had always been more interested in bows and arrows and horses and dogs and swimming. You will guess that each thought the other silly, but when at last they were both seated after a meal, it was chiefly of the whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice sort, in a beautiful pillared room, which Aravis would have liked better if Louise Celine's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about it all the time. Lurcine at last asked her why she was running away from home. When Aravis had finished telling her story, Louise Celine said, But, darling, why don't you marry Ahash de Tarkin? Everyone's crazy about him. My husband says he's becoming to be one of the greatest men in Calormen. He has just made Grand Vizier. Now old Axra has died. Didn't you know? I don't care. I can't stand the sight of him, said Aravis. But, darling, only think. 3 palaces, and one of them that's so beautiful, one down on the lake at Eichleen. Positively roats of pearls, I'm told baths of ass's milk, and you'd see such a lot of me. He can keep his pearls and palaces as far as I'm concerned, said Aravis. You always were a queer girl, Aravis, said Louise Celine. What more do you want? In the end, however, Aravis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about telling getting the 2 horses out of the north gate and then onto the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river, and Larice Celine had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Arabas herself. She suggested that she could be carried out in the litter with the curtains drawn, but Larice Celine told her that litters were only used in the city, and the sight of one going through the gates would be certain to lead to questions. When they had talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Arabas found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Larice Celine clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea. There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrock's garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there's a little water door, only for the palace people, of course. But then, you know, dear," and she tittered a little, "we almost are palace people. I say, it is lucky for you that you came to me. The dear Tisserand, may he live forever, is so kind. We're asked to the palace almost every day, and it's like a second home. I love all the dear princesses and princes, and I positively adore Prince Rapidash. I run in and see many of the palace ladies at my hour of the night or day. Why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside it, and even if we were caught, all would be lost," said Arabas. "Oh, darling, don't get so excited," said Larice Celine. "I was going to say, even if we were caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad jokes. I'm getting quite well known for them. Only the other day, do listen, dear, this is frightfully funny." "I meant all would be lost for me," said Arabas a little sharply. "Oh, yes, I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can you think of any better plan?" Arabas couldn't and answered, "No, we'll have to risk it. When can we start?" "Oh, not tonight," said Larice Celine. "Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes. And the whole palace will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It would have to be tomorrow night." This was bad news for Arabas, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Larice Celine went out to the banquet, for Arabas was very tired of her giggling and her talk about dresses and parties and weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Larice Celine wanted to go back on the whole arrangement, and kept on telling Arabas that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice, inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. "And with the pleasant peasant boy, too," said Larice Celine. "Darling, think of it. It's not nice." Arabas had thought of it a good deal, but she was so tired of Larice Celine's silliness by now. For the first time she began to think that traveling with Shasta was really rather more fun than a fashionable life in Tashbaan. So she only replied, "You forgot that I'll be nobody, just like him, when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised." "And to think," said Larice Celine, almost crying, "that if only you had sense you could be the wife of a Grand Vizier." Arabas went away to have a private word with the horses. "You must go with the groom a little before sunset down to the tombs," she said. "No more of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again, but there'll have to be food in Hwin's saddlebags, and a full water-skin behind yours, Bree. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge." "And then Narnia in the north," whispered Bree. "But what if Shasta is not at the tombs?" "Wait for him, of course," said Arabas. "I hope you've been quite comfortable." "Never better stabled in my life," said Bree. "But if the husband of that tittering Tarkheena friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, then I think the head groom is cheating him." Arabas and Larice Celine had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later they were ready to start. Arabas was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house and wore a veil over her face. They had agreed that if any questions were asked, Larisaline would pretend that Erebus was a slave and she was taking it as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here there were, of course, soldiers on guards, but the officers knew Larisaline quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A fair number of courtiers and slaves and others were still moving about here, but this only made the two girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the hall of pillars, and then to the hall of statues, and down the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in the dim light of the lamps. Presently they came out into the garden court, which sloped downhill in a number of terraces. On the far side of that they came to the old palace. It had already grown almost quite dark, and now they found themselves in a maze of corridors, lit by only an occasional torch fixed in brackets on the walls. Larisaline halted at a place where you had to go either left or right. "Go on, do go on," whispered Erebus, whose heart was beating terribly, and who still felt that her father might run into them at any corner. "I'm just wondering," said Larisaline. "I'm not absolutely sure which way we go from here. I think it's the left. Yes, I'm almost sure it's the left. What fun this is." They took the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lighted at all, and which soon began going down steps. "It's all right," said Larisaline. "I'm sure we're right now. I remember these steps." But at that moment a moving light appeared ahead. A second later there appeared from a round distant corner the dark shapes of two men walking backwards and carrying tall candles. And of course it was only before royalties that people walk backwards. Erebus felt Larisaline grip her arm, that sort of sudden grip which is almost a pinch, and which means that the person who is gripping you is frightened indeed. Erebus thought it odd that Larisaline should be so afraid of the Tursarock, if he were really such a friend of hers. But there was no time to go back on thinking. Larisaline was hurrying her back to the top of the steps, on tiptoes, and groping wildly along the walls. "Here's a door," she whispered. "Quick!" They went in and drew the door softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Erebus could hear Larisaline's breathing, that she was terrified. "Tash, preserve us," whispered Larisaline. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was a soft carpet under their feet, and they groped forward into the room and blundered onto a sofa. "Let's lie down behind it," whimpered Larisaline. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtain wall, and the two girls got down. Larisaline managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Erebus's face stuck out behind the sofa, so that if anyone came into the room with a light and happened to look in exactly the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once look like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Erebus shoved desperately to try to make Larisaline give her a little more room, but Larisaline, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Erebus at last, in the tiniest possible whisper. I think so," began Larisaline, "but my poor nerves—" And then came the most terrible noise they could have heard at that moment, the noise of the door opening. And then came light, and because Erebus couldn't get her head any further in behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves, deaf and dumb, as Erebus rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret councils, walking backwards and carrying the candles. They took up their stand, one at each end of the sofa. This was a good thing, for of course it was now harder for anyone to see Erebus once a slave was in front of her, and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap, by which she immediately knew he was the Tisroc. The least of all the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all the clothes and weapons of the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat, and such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans, that Aravis couldn't help thinking the Narnians' fashions, at any rate for men, looked nicer. After him came a tall young man with a feathered and jeweled turban on his head, and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little humped-backed, wizened old man, in whom she recognized with a shudder the new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ahashta Tarkan himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan with a sigh of contentment. The young man took his place standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid his face flat on the carpet. Chapter 8. In the House of the Tisroc. "Oh, my father, and oh, the delight of my eyes," began the young man, muttering the words very quickly and sulkingly, and not at all as if the Tisroc were the delight of his eyes. "May you live forever. But you have utterly destroyed me. If you had given me the swiftest of the galleys at sunrise, when I first saw the ship of the accursed barbarians was gone from her place, I would perhaps have overtaken them. But you persuaded me to send first, and to see if they had not merely moved round the point into better anchorage. And now the whole day has been wasted, and they are gone, out of my reach. The false jade, the—" And here he added a great many descriptions of Queen Susan, which would not look at all nice in print. For of course this young man was Prince Rabadash, and of course the false jade was Susan of Narnia. "Compose yourself, O my son," said the Tisroc, "for the departure of guests makes a wound that is easily healed in the heart of a judicious host." "But I want her," cried the prince. "I must have her. I shall die if I do not get her. False, proud, black-hearted daughter of a dog that she is. I cannot sleep, and my food has no savor, and my eyes are darkened because of her beauty. I must have the barbarian queen." "How well it was said by a gifted poet," observed the Vizier, raising his face, in a somewhat dusty condition, from the carpet, "that deep draughts from the fountain of reason are desirable in order to extinguish the fire of youthful love." This seemed to exasperate the prince. "Dog," he shouted, directing a series of well-aimed kicks at the hindquarters of the Vizier, "do not dare to quote those poets to me. I have had Maximin verses flung at me all day long, and I can endure them no more." I am afraid Aravis did not feel at all sorry for the Vizier. The Tisroc was apparently sunk in thought, but when, after a long pause, he noticed what was happening, he said tranquilly, "My son, by all means cease from kicking the venerable and enlightened Vizier, for as a costly jewel retains its value even if hidden in a dunghill, so old age and discretion are to be respected even in the vile persons of our subjects. Be us therefore, and tell us what you desire and propose." "I desire and propose, O my father," said Rabadash, "that you immediately call out your invincible armies and invade the thrice accursed land of Narnia, and waste it with fire and sword, and add it to your illimitable empire, killing their high king and all his blood except the Queen Susan, for I must have her as my wife, though she shall learn a sharp lesson first." "Understand, O my son," said the Tisroc, "that no words you can speak will move me to open war against Narnia." "If you were not my father, O ever-living Tisroc," said the prince, grinding his teeth, "I should say that was the word of a coward." "And if you were not my son, O most inflammable Rabadash," replied his father, "your life would be short and your death slow when you had said it. The cool, placid voice in which he spoke these words made Arivas's blood run cold. "But why, O my father?" said the prince, this time in a much more respectful voice. "Why should we think twice about punishing Narnia any more than about hanging an idle slave or sending a worn-out horse to be made into dog's meat? It is not the force size of one of your least provinces. 1,000 spears could conquer it in 5 weeks. It is unseemingly blot on the skirts of your empire." "Most undoubtedly," said the Tisroc. "These little barbarian countries that call themselves free, which is much to say idle, disordered, and unprofitable, are hateful to the gods and to all persons of discernment. Why, then, have we suffered such a land as Narnia to remain thus long unsubdued?" "Know, O enlightened prince," said the Grand Vizier, "that until the year in which your exalted father began his salutary and unending reign, the land of Narnia was covered with ice and snow, and moreover ruled by a most powerful enchantress." "This I know very well, O loquacious Vizier," answered the prince, "but I know also that the enchantress is dead, and the ice and snow have vanished, and so Narnia is now wholesome, fruitful, and delicious. And this change, O most learned prince, has doubtless been brought to pass by the powerful incantations of those wicked persons who now call themselves kings and queens of Narnia." "I am rather of the opinion," said Rabadash, "that it has come about by the altercation of the stars and the operation of natural causes." "All this," said the Tisroc, "is a question for the disputations of learned men. I will never believe that so great an alteration and the killing of the old enchantress were effected without the aid of strong magic. And such things are to be expected in that land, which is chiefly inhabited by demons in the shape of beasts that talk like men, and monsters that are half man and half beast. It is commonly reported that the High King of Narnia, whom may the gods utterly reject, is supported by a demon of hideous aspect and irresistible maleficence, who appears in the shape of a lion. Therefore, the attacking of Narnia is a dark and doubtful enterprise, and I am determined not to put my hand out further than I can draw it back." "How blessed is Calormen," said the Vizier, propping his face up again, "on whose ruler the gods have been pleased to bestow prudence and circumspection. Yet, as the irrefutable and spacious Tisroc has said, it is very grievous to be constrained to keep our hands off such a dainty dish as Narnia. Gifted was that poet who said that." But at this point Astra noticed an impatient movement of the prince's toe and became suddenly silent. "It is very grievous," said the Tisroc in his deep, quiet voice. "Every morning the sun is darkened in my eyes, and every night my sleep is the less refreshing, because I remember that Narnia is still free." "Oh, my father," said Rabadash, "how if I show you a way by which you can stretch out your arm and take Narnia, and yet draw it back unharmed if the attempt proved unfortunate?" "If you can show me that, O Rabadash," said the Tisroc, "you will be the best of sons." "Hear then, O father, this very night, in this hour, I will take but 200 horses and ride across the desert, and it shall seem to all men that you know nothing of my going. On the second morning I shall be at the gates of King Lune's castle of Anvard in Ashland. They are at peace with us and unprepared, and I shall take Anvard before they have bestirred themselves. Then I will ride through the pass above Anvard and down through Narnia to Carpavel. The High King will not be there. When I left him, he was already preparing a raid against the giants on his northern border. I shall find Carpavel most likely with open gates, and ride in. I shall exercise prudence and courtesy, and spill as little Narnian blood as I can. And what then remains but to sit here till the splendid Hyaline puts in, with Queen Susan on board, catch my strayed bird as she sets foot ashore, swing her into the saddle, and then ride back to Anvard." "But is it not probable, O my son," said the Tisroc, that at the taking of the woman either King Edmund or you will lose his life? They will be a small company, said Rabdabash, and I will order 10 of my men to disarm and bind him, restraining my vehement desire for his blood, so that there shall be no deadly cause of war between you and the High King. And how, if the splendor Hylene is that care prevail before you? I do not look for that with these winds, O my father. And lastly, O my resourceful son, said the Tisroc, you have made clear how all this might give you the barbarian woman, but not how it helps me with the overthrowing of Narnia. O my father, can it have escaped you that though I and my horsemen will come and go through Narnia like an arrow from a bow, yet we shall have Anvard forever? And when you hold Anvard, you sit at the very gate of Narnia, and your garrison in Anvard can be increased by little till it is a great host. It is spoken with understanding and foresight, but how do I draw back my arm if all this miscarries? You shall say that I did it, without your knowledge and against your will, and without your blessing, being constrained by the violence of my love and the impetuosity of youth. And how if the High King then demands that we send back the barbarian woman, his sister? Oh, my father, be assured that he will not. For though the fancy of a woman has rejected this marriage, the High King Peter is a man of prudence and understanding, who will in no way wish to lose the high honor and advantage of being allied to our house, and seeing his nephew and grandnephew on the throne of Calormen. He will not see that, if I live forever, as is no doubt your wish, said the Tisroc in an even drier voice than usual. And also, O my father, and O the delight of my eyes, said the prince, after a moment of awkward silence, we shall write letters as if from the queen, to say that she loves me and has no desire to return to Narnia. For it is well known that women are as changeable as weathercocks, and even though they do not wholly believe the letters, they will not dare to come to Tashbaan in arms to fetch her. O enlightened Vizir, said the Tisroc, bestow your wisdom upon us concerning this strange proposal. O eternal Tisroc, answered Eoashta, the strength of paternal affection is not unknown to me, and I have often heard that sons are in the eyes of their fathers more precious than carbuncles. How then shall I dare freely to unfold to you my mind in a manner in which may imperil the life of this exalted prince? Undoubtedly you will dare, replied the Tisroc, because you will find that the dangers of not doing so are at least equally great. To hear is to obey, moaned the wretched man. Know then, O reasonable Tisroc, in the first place, that the danger of the prince is so not altogether so great as might appear. For the gods have withheld from the barbarians the light of discretion, as that their poetry is not, like ours, full of choice epigons and useful maxims, but is all of love and war. Therefore nothing will appear to them more noble and admirable than such a mad enterprise as this of Ow! For the prince, at the word mad, had kicked him. Deist, O my son, said Tisroc, and you, estimable Vizir, whether he detests it or not, by no means allow the flow of your eloquence to be interrupted, for nothing is more suitable to persons of gravity and decorum than to endure minor inconveniences with constancy. To hear is to obey, said the Vizir, wriggling himself around a little, so as to get his hinder parts further away from Rabadash's toe. Nothing, I say, will seem as pardonable, if not estimable, in their eyes as this hazardous attempt, especially because it is undertaken for the love of a woman. Therefore, if the prince by misfortune fell into their hands, they would be assuredly not to kill him. Nay, it may even be that though he failed to carry off the queen, yet the sight of his great valor and the extremity of his passion might incline her heart to him. This is a good point, old babbler, said Rabadash. Very good, however it came into your ugly head. The praise of my masters is the light of my eyes, said Ashra. And secondly, O Tisroc, whose reign must and shall be interminable. I think that with the aid of the gods it is very likely that Anvard will fall into the prince's hands, and if so, we have Narnia by the throat." There was a long pause, and the room became so silent that the two girls hardly dared to breathe. At last the Tisroc spoke. "Go, my son," he said, "and do as you have said, but expect no help nor countenance from me. I will not avenge you if you are killed, and I will not deliver you if the barbarians cast you into prison. And if, either in success or failure, you shed a drop more than you need of Narnian noble blood, and open war arises from it, my father shall never fall upon you again, and your next brother shall have your place in Calormen. Now go, be swift, secret, and fortunate. May the strength of Tash, the inexorable and irresistible, be in your sword and lance." "To hear is to obey," cried Rabadash, and after kneeling for a moment to kiss his father's hands, he rushed from the room, greatly to the disappointment of Erebus, who was now horribly cramped. The Tisroc and Visor remained. "Oh, Visor," said the Tisroc, "it is certain that no living soul knows of this council with thee have had tonight." "Oh, my master," said Ashta, "it is not possible that anyone should know. For that very reason I proposed, and you in your infallible wisdom agreed, that we should meet here in the old palace, where no council is ever held, and none of the household has any occasion to come." "It is well," said the Tisroc. "If any man knew, I would see to it that he died before an hour passed. And do you also, O prudent Visor, forget it. I sponge away from you my own heart, and from yours all knowledge of the prince's plan. He has gone without my knowledge or my consent, I know not whither, because of his violence and the rash and disobedient disposition of youth. No man will be more astonished than you and I to hear that Anvard is in his hands." "To hear is to obey," said Astra. "That is why you will never think, even in your secret heart, that I am the hardest hearted of fathers, who thus send my firstborn son on an errand so likely to be his death, pleasing as it must be to you who do not love the prince, for I see into the bottom of your mind." "O impeccable Tisroc," said the Visor, "in comparison with you I love neither the prince, nor my own life, nor the bread, nor water, nor the light of sun." "Your sentiments," said the Tisroc, "are elevated and correct. I also love none of these things in comparison with the glory and strength of my throne. If the prince succeeds, we have Archenland, and perhaps hereafter Narnia. If he fails, I have 18 other sons, and Rabadash, and after the manner of the eldest sons of kings, was the beginning to be dangerous. More than 5 Tisrocs and Tashbaan have died before their time because their eldest sons, enlightened princes, grew tired of waiting for their throne. He had better cool his blood abroad than boil it in action here. And now, O excellent Visor, the excess of my paternal anxiety inclines me to sleep. Command the musicians to my chamber, but before you lie down, call back the pardon we wrote for the third cook. I feel within me the manifest prognostics of indigestion." "To hear is to obey," said the Grand Visor, and he crawled backwards on all fours to the door, rose, bowed, and went out. Even then the Tisroc remained seated in silence on the divan until Erebus almost began to be afraid that he had dropped asleep. But at last, with a great creaking and sighing, he heaved up his enormous body, signed to the slaves to precede him with the lights, and went out. The door closed behind him. The room was once more totally dark, and the two girls could breathe freely again.